Howdy YouTube, and welcome to this episode of the Gunman. So today we're doing the polishing stage on this X250 Mercedes Benz. So I actually did do another video on this bonnet here, and we just slammed a couple of coats of Standox Standard Clear down on this Mercedes bonnet. And yeah, so we ended up getting like a few silicone holes, or fish eyes, what you might call. So what I did, when it was still wet in the booth, I dabbed those fish eyes in, as you can see here. So I just got like a brush touch brush with some clear coat, the same clear coat that went on the bonnet, same batch and everything. Dabbed it in, baked the bonnet twice, in fact. So it's nice and dry. And then the next morning I came in and got my tungsten block, and then we're going to be removing the high spots with that tungsten block. Now, every time I do a video when I use this tungsten, I'll get lots of questions. So this time I've actually decided that I will be including a link to where I got mine in the description of this video. So check that out if you do want to get one of those tungstens. But apart from that, just be careful with them. I mean, it's the kind of thing that they do have some sharp edges on them. So yeah, just around curves of the panels, just careful that you don't dig the edges in. But at the end of the day, it's like anything, practice makes perfect. You're only going to get better the more that you use them. So maybe just start by using it down low on panels maybe, and just until you've got the hang of it, until you're comfortable using them. I would definitely not start on a black Mercedes Benz bonnet, you know, but I'm at the point where obviously I'm pretty confident that I can use it. So as always, there's more than one way to skin a cat. So before these were around, or if I didn't have one for whatever reason, there would be other ways that I could do this. What I would probably do is start with a coarser sandpaper on a block. So what I'm using here was 1500 grit. Because I've got the profile of those raised sections. So originally they were lower sections. So they were indentations in the clear coat because I had the fish eyes opening up. So I then got the touch up brush and then filled them up so that the profile now is actually too high. So with the tungsten block, I shaved that right down so that the profile should be around even with the rest of the clear coat. And then to finish that off, we're just giving it a bit of a block with some 1500 grit. But as I was going to say before, if I didn't have the tungsten, I guess you could possibly even use razor blades, but you do have to be a little bit more careful with razor blades. I've found a razor blade is actually more likely to dig into the paint more so than a tungsten is. So that's something to keep in mind. So you could either do that, or you could actually just block it without using a razor blade or a tungsten. But if I was to just block it, you'd really want to start off with a coarser sandpaper. If all you did was go straight to 1500 or even 2000 grit, it's just going to sand over the top and you'll be left with a bit of a hump where that raised section was. So what I'd probably want to do is start with at least 1200 grit and then work your way up through the grades and finish with somewhere like 15, at least finish with 1500, preferably 2000 or above. But once you start getting above 2000 grit sanding papers, they get really expensive. So I think like a box of 10 small 3000 grits from 3M, like the 3M Trizact grits, they're something like 80 or 70 or $80, and that was like 10 years ago. We don't use them here because the boss just said, hey, get them things out of here, they're costing me too much money, which I accept that, and I get it, so I don't mind working around it. At the end of the day, I can make do with what we've got here. Yeah, it's one of those things. In a perfect world, we would get everything that we ever wanted, but sometimes you just got to make do with what you got. So the first compound I was using just before was G6, Flickr G6, and that was with the lamb's wool pad. That was that big lamb's wool pad. Now, they are really grunty, like they are so coarse, it is not funny. But because there was so many nibs and it's a black car as well, I really wanted to cut right into it to get all of those 2000 or 1500 grit scratches out. Now you do have to be very careful when you're using the lamb's wool, and as you can see here on all those little edges, I'm actually using the foam pad, so the white pad there. And I was also using the next step up, so like a step finer in the grades of compounds. And what I'm using here is the 3M stage 1. So I can't remember off the top of my head exactly the product codes, but with the 3M range, you've got like step 1, 2, and I think they've even got a step 3, but we don't use the step 3. I think the step 3 is like their wax, but yeah, it's one of those things. Like everyone's got their own little preference on which compounds you use, but you know, most of the time I don't use the G6. I find it messy and coarse and it leaves swirl marks, but on this specific job here, it made sense to use it, because I really wanted to get rid of all of those denib marks properly with that coarse lamb's wool pad, and then I did it as a 3-stage polish. So I then went over it with the step 1 in the 3M range with the white pad, and now I'm going over it with the step 2 in the 3M range with the black pad. Another thing worth keeping in mind is cleanliness is next to godliness, so make sure you clean your pads out in between each stage. Wipe each stage of compound off. So once you finish using your G6, if you're using your G6 or whatever you use first, make sure you get most of that off before you move on to your next step, because you don't want, I mean, a little bit of contamination. It's not like the end of the world. It's not like sort of like mixing the wrong paints together or anything. Yeah, that's pretty bad news, but yeah, I guess you still want to eliminate as much of you can as you can of that sort of contamination. But yeah, another thing, it's just, it takes time. Polishing and buffing does take time. You sort of need to just let the buff do the work in a way. I guess you're sort of relying on the buff, the pad, and the compound to do the work. But yeah, you really need to like work that compound into the panel, I guess. And that's what I'm doing here. I actually really do quite like the 3M stage 2 or step 2 glaze. I've always used this like most of the way through my entire career, and it's a really good glaze. I've found a lot of the time it's all you need. A lot of the time you won't even need to give it a hand wax or anything like that. I've actually heard some people say that you shouldn't hand wax paint before the 30 days because it can sort of like, I don't know, trap the solvents in there or something. It's something that isn't really commonly talked about in the trade, in my circles anyway. Like, no one I've ever worked with has said that, but it's more online. A few people have made a mention to it. So if you know more about that, be sure to let us know, you know. But I mean, as I say, I try to avoid waxing cars anyway. It's usually like a get out of jail free. Like if I do have swirl marks in a job like this, when I get it outside after I have done my step 1 and step 2, then I'll wax it. But I prefer to get the polishing done without having to wax it, because I think it's more something that's going to last. Whereas I think the waxes, sometimes the waxes can just fill in imperfections, and it's kind of like cheating, because the wax will eventually come out. Whereas if you polished it properly, it should stay looking like that for quite some time into the future. But it's one of those things, like, you do need to continue to look after your paintwork. It's not like I can just make this bonnet look perfect and it's going to stay like that forever. No, the owner of the car has to sort of take a bit of responsibility from themselves to actually make sure that it does look good going into the future. Whether or not that's up to them, you know, getting it cut and polished every few years, you know, 3 or 4 years, or just giving it a hand wax themselves with like a good Canuba wax or something like that every year. I try to do that once a year on my car. I don't always get to do it, but I would like to at least wax it once a year. So yeah, it's all good. I mean, another thing worth keeping in mind is get some microfiber cloths. If these weren't microfiber, I would just about be guaranteed that I'm scratching it now when I'm wiping this compound off here. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Just keep it clean, and I don't know, you should try to avoid wiping your polish off in circles. So you should really wipe it off in, like what I'm doing now, in lines. And yeah, then just get it out in the sun and make sure it's not swirly. Maybe even leave it overnight if you can, because sometimes, as I say before, like the compounds can even come out. Like sometimes it can look great, and then the day later it's like swirl marks or scratch marks in it and stuff like that. So I guess that's worse with certain compounds. Some compounds have like fillers in them, and it just looks good for a short amount of time, but then when they come out, it just doesn't look so good anymore. So look, at the end of the day, all I was doing is showing you what I do. You know, I'm not saying this is the right way or the wrong way, but as you can see here, this is an acceptable, that's a sellable result right there. You know, I can sell that. I can be proud of the work that I've done on that vehicle. I hope you guys learned something. Hope you enjoyed watching. Until next time, get out there and paint some shit. Gunman out.